There's certainly been a noticeably intense escalation in hostility from both major parties, the Republicans and Democrats, which has sought to effectively blame China for their own failures uh, to respond to the coronavirus pandemic and redirect the rightful outrage of ordinary Americans who are suffering onto China. But I think it's important to understand this trend within a broader context. The pandemic and current crisis is being utilized by the U.S. establishment to advance and escalate its long-term, already existing agenda of promoting a new Cold War with China. Um, and in order to understand this, we need to talk a little bit about U.S. History. So basically, since the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. Has sought to establish sole global supremacy, and it's pursued endless destructive regime change wars against far weaker countries in an effort to squash anything that threatens this agenda. And with China's rise as the world's second most powerful economy, and as a source of an alternative source for investment, financial, diplomatic relationships with a range of countries around the world. As this ascendance has taken place over the past decade, the focus of U.S. foreign policy has shifted from the so-called war on terror to pursuing what's sometimes called a China containment strategy, but what is effectively a new Cold War strategy against China. This originated under the Obama era with the Asia pivot, which has sought to militarily encircle China in the Asia Pacific. It's what Secretary of State called a necessity in order to ensure so-called American leadership into the 21st century. This agenda has become more explicit and more hostile under the Trump administration. So we've seen official rhetoric regularly refer to China's ascendance as a so-called threat. National security documents have identified so-called great power competition as taking over from terrorism as the primary concern of U.S. foreign policy, identifying China along with countries such as Russia and Iran. And we've even seen Secretary of State Mike Pompeo openly refer and openly call the Chinese Communist Party, quote, the central threat of our times, and has called on NATO partners to address this threat, so-called threat. And so, of course, through the Trump administration, we've seen the trade war. We've seen pretty intense diplomatic campaigns to discourage and disrupt China's relations with developing countries through this narrative of so-called debt trap diplomacy, which has been proliferated, and as well as discouraging the U.S.'s own allies from engaging with China. Most noticeably, we've seen the campaign against Huawei. And so while there's certainly been an intensification during the coronavirus pandemic of this agenda, it's important to understand it as a long-term trend and understand it within this context. Yeah, it's been consistently hostile and antagonistic, and it's interesting. It seems so long ago, January, but when the outbreak was first emerging in Wuhan, the overwhelming representation in the Western media was that China was behaving over the top. It was behaving in an authoritarian manner, draconian. It was doing too much, and it was repressing the human rights of its people with the lockdown measures. But this has shifted as the US has struggled to contain the novel coronavirus, and as other Western countries have struggled to contain it. And a lot of these wealthy Western countries have emerged as some of the world's worst coronavirus outbreaks. The media coverage shifted from saying that China did too much to now saying China didn't do enough, that the Chinese government engaged in a cover-up, that it was too slow to act, that it colluded with the World Health Organization, and ultimately that China is to blame for the disastrous situation in these countries with tens of thousands of people dying. This shift also coincides with the Trump administration launching effectively a PR campaign to shift blame onto China for their inadequate response. So we know this from leaked government cables, which have outlined this sort of strategy of seeking to shift the blame onto China and to accuse China of a cover-up. So it's coincided very much with this agenda from Washington. We've seen similar memos from both the leadership of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party seeking to attack each other as being so-called soft on China and enabling China to cause the situation in the United States. And so one can't help but come away from this sort of experience with the opinion that the mainstream Western media's primary concern with respect to China doesn't appear to be honest and balanced reporting, but crafting an anti-China narrative that's useful for the United States and its allies. This unfortunately isn't surprising. We've seen this dynamic play out time and time again. Anytime there's a country that's a so-called enemy that's targeted by US foreign policy, whether it's Iraq, Libya, Syria, Venezuela, Iran, or elsewhere. So this is a long-term trend that happens time and time again within the media that we're seeing again with China. I think it's a reflection of the structure of US and Western political and economic systems. So US and Western political and economic, like these ruling establishments of these countries, their governments, by and large represent the interests of the wealthy and of corporations, of the elites of these countries. And we've seen skyrocketing inequality produced by this throughout the past 4 decades of neoliberalism, which has caused so much upsurge in populist movements and in movements seeking redistributive wealth in these countries. And then if you look at what the governments of these countries and the mainstream parties represent, these elites and corporations, and if you look at the so-called free press, it's run by and large by a very small number of wealthy corporations. So there's an overlap between the interests and politics between the media and the government. And so this is just structurally tends to produce a alignment of narratives. And so you have this sort of structural issue within these countries. So the so-called free press effectively functions like a state media for the United States, for example. And then you also have the fact that there is a sort of revolving door of people between so-called independent think tanks in places like Washington, between major newspapers like the New York Times, Washington Post, and between the sort of government apparatus of policy analysts and different governmental figures, even with the military. And so you have sort of a revolving door between all of these institutions, and it produces really like an echo chamber of the same opinions put forward. And then also there is the trend of them being unwilling to really push back on government narratives, especially with respect to foreign policy. And so, for example, with the coronavirus media coverage, you've seen a lot of US government claims regarding, for example, this conspiracy theory that coronavirus emerged from a lab in Wuhan. Essentially, it's just the headline will be intelligence says, or the US intelligence community says, or State Department cable says. And it's not really pushed back in terms of, well, does the US State Department or government or intelligence agency have perhaps a bias, or do they have an interest in how China is presented? It's just sort of presented and taken as impartial. And so you have this situation where there's a sort of overlapping or collaboration between the so-called free media and the government. Yeah, I think there's a couple different important factors which come together. A lot of times when the United States or Western countries engage in foreign policy or their different agendas with respect to these countries like Iraq or Vietnam or Venezuela, or they usually cloak their language in a noble intention. So today we often hear language of human rights or humanitarianism or democracy being invoked whenever they need to advance their foreign policy agenda. And so this creates a great deal of confusion amongst ordinary people who are, of course, interested in the well-being of others around the world. Most people don't share the agenda of maybe their government, but they do care about things like human rights, about people's well-being. And so if they're told over and over and over again that there's some great human rights atrocity happening here, let's say in Venezuela or Iran, and they were told this story over and over and over again, it does shift their perception of the issue. Um, and uh, it's related to this sort of media situation we've been talking about, where there's basically any alternative voice there's no real substantial alternative presented within the U.S. and Western media sort of ecosystem. The vast majority of media outlets are controlled by a very small number of corporations, and the vast majority of media that has really any power is or sorry, the basically like the media that people are opposed to every day that people consume. There's a small number of maybe independent alternative outlets, such as my colleagues at the who run the Gray Zone, that challenge or present an alternative perspective. The vast majority of what people are exposed to every day, that they might read in the newspaper, that they might see if they flick on their TV or go on the internet or go on Twitter, is going to be these massive corporate media outlets, which all push substantially the same narrative. And so they're getting the same message sort of thrown at them day after day after day, and there isn't really any alternative presented. And these very powerful media outlets that really control the discourse in these countries, or at least dominate it, will never invite someone like me to speak. They'll never invite anyone with an alternative perspective to speak. And so you're really presented with one opinion over and over and over again. And this does unfortunately shift the way that people perceive the situation, and sort of prevents there being any opposition to these sort of nefarious foreign policy ends, like overthrowing governments or imposing devastating sanctions on a country from the global south, like Venezuela or Cuba or Iran, because people are confused about the situation. And this also builds upon a lengthy history. Like, this isn't some sort of new modern phenomenon. We have centuries of this within Western countries, of sort of imperial colonial relations with the majority of countries in the world and the global south and indigenous peoples. And it also was built upon this sort of noble intention of usually presented in the language of quote unquote civilizing the savage people or the barbarian people. And so this sort of human rights ideology is really built on this long-term foundation of this sort of Western exceptionalism or superiority.